You're watching C-SPAN 3 History. We continue our look at the Pentagon Papers now with the man who leaked them to the press in 1971, Daniel Ellsberg. Mr. Ellsberg spoke in 2001 on the 30th anniversary of that event. This is about an hour.
And in that time, I hope to focus on just one of the many aspects that will be covered today. And that's the Pentagon Papers. Can you hear me? Is that all right? Can you hear me? How is it back there? Okay. I want to talk about the Pentagon Papers as leak or unauthorized disclosure. I first heard this phrase, unauthorized disclosure, in connection with the bill that was passed by both houses of Congress last fall for the first time criminalizing unauthorized disclosure. And I immediately, which was fortunately and unexpectedly vetoed by President Clinton, unexpectedly because his own Attorney General, Janet Reno, had supported the bill in its final form that was passed. I immediately liked the word unauthorized disclosure because I've never really liked the word leak. It seemed a little pejorative, demeaning, didn't sound good, didn't have the ring that it had for me. And my wife has especially always disliked me being called a leaker. She felt it made me sound incontinent. So I'm an unauthorized disclosure, dear, from now on. The question then I'd like to address is, what can we learn from this experience, from the experience of the last 30 or 50 years, about the role of unauthorized disclosure in this country, in the world, and above all in a democratic republic, and one that means to remain so? When I was on trial and afterwards when I was lecturing, I had occasion very often to quote a statement made after he was in office by James Madison, the author of the First Amendment. I'm sure you all have heard it, but it really deserves repeating and pondering over and over again. Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives. Popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but the prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. Now, we've seen farce, a lot of it in Watergate or Irangate. We've seen the plumbers. We've seen tragedy, certainly, and primarily not tragedy for America, though it was a tragedy, more like a crime, a tragedy for Vietnam that we imposed on Vietnam from the very beginning of that conflict in our support of the French. Vietnam War, of course, was not only an unwinnable war, as I'd come to see by 66 or 67 in Vietnam, which was enough for me and many others to try to work against it from inside. When I'd read the earliest portions of the Pentagon Papers, which were the last that I read just in September of 1969, by which time I would say I had already been committed for 2 years at least for getting us out of Vietnam. When I read the earliest pages, I realized the volumes, I realized that I was reading not just the record of a tragic mistake, but of a colonial war in which the United States had been a participant from its earliest position in the truly tragic decision made by Franklin Roosevelt in the last months of his life and persisted in by Harry Truman to support the French in their determination to reconquer their colonial empire in Indochina and elsewhere. That was tragic. At those days, you might say, with the UN Charter's recognition of colonial rule as a legitimate form of rule, recognized, not criminalized, it'd be hard to say that was a crime at that time. But we can judge it morally, politically, in various ways, in many ways. In any case, what I learned when I read that in September of '69, very late in the game for me, was that this was not only a war that we couldn't win, we could not defeat the people fighting for independence from foreign rule. They would not be defeated by anything we could do. They would not give up. They would not give up against us any more than the French. But it was a war that we had no right to win, a war we should not win, a war we should not be in, and that killing in that war, mostly financed by us, was unjustifiable homicide. And that should be ended as soon as possible, not gracefully, not saving our face, as I would have been willing to do to some degree before 67 or 68, but as soon as possible. And I had no illusions that that would be easy. But that was one of the things that drove me. In other words, having read these papers, which for me were authorized. The disclosure to me was an authorized disclosure. I was a consultant at that point for the Rand Corporation, but one trusted to keep its secrets, no matter how much I disagreed. And I had been tested on that many, many times. I didn't get those secrets because they just thought, they hoped I would keep them secret. Anyone associated with me knew that I was one of those who would keep certain kinds of information about planning, about estimates, about proposals, from unauthorized persons, meaning not just unauthorized persons, let me come back to that, but specifically from the American public, from Congress, from political rivals. In most cases, the issue didn't even arise of concern whether I would keep them from the Russians or the Vietnamese. In most cases, we were reading about things that the Russians and the Vietnamese had been told directly by us, that is, by our leaders. Threats that were made that were no secret to our opponents. Actions, attacks on North Vietnam, attacks on Cambodia, attacks on Laos that were no secret from the people under the bombs, were secret only from the American people and from Congress. And in some cases, that secret has an ironic aspect to it. When William Beecher of the New York Times revealed that we were bombing Cambodia, one might say it ceased to be secret. Not so. It was not regarded as a fact, as a happening, as an experience by the American public for many years afterwards, until a real leak occurred. That was because the evening of Beecher's announcement, the Defense Department simply said, not even dignifying it with a White House denial, the Defense Department just said routinely, that story's wrong, that's not happening. And so it wasn't happening. In a period when presidents were believed, were thought maybe not to tell everything, maybe to be a little misleading, a little exaggerating sometimes, but not to lie, which was a mistake. Presidents do all those things. They conceal, they cover. All officials do. Congressmen do. It's part of the game. Lawyers do. They also lie. I'm talking about presidents now, and the people who work for them. So I had been known for 5 years at that point, really 10 years, to be reliable in keeping secrets that I strongly disagreed with in the policy, that I thought were bad, terrible, even disastrous, which is the way I felt about our nuclear war planning. Disastrous. And yet, anyone around me knew I was one of those who could be given such secrets. I didn't have to agree with the policy. I would keep it. That's the way I was till '69. Now, for the first time to perceive that this, what I was reading about, was not just dangerous and costly and tragic and everything, all of which it was, but something close to murder, and I don't use that word rhetorically, unjustifiable homicide. Let the lawyers tell me what the best way of describing that is, but killing that should not go on. That did affect my sense of what it was worth doing for me personally to stop it. But I had a much stronger incentive at that very time than that, which caused the, which was absolutely crucial. I was given information because I had worked on Vietnam options in the beginning of the year for Henry Kissinger, working for Nixon. In fact, I had drafted a set of alternative options and drafted a set of questions after that called National Security Study Memorandum 1 to be given, and had gone over the answers for the president. For that reason, I was given a piece of information with my top secret clearance by someone who had been in the White House and left in the fall of 1961. In the fall of 1961, Mort Halperin told me, because of my background and his knowledge of my reliability, which was quite justified, what option Nixon had chosen. And it wasn't actually one of the ones I had put in the set, interestingly. It is not uncommon, as the Pentagon Papers showed, presidents very commonly end up with a policy that does not really correspond to any one of the alternatives that any agency gave him. And that was true in this case. What Nixon had chosen, I was told, was a policy of secret threats of escalation, just like the ones that Johnson had secretly given Ho Chi Minh in the summer of 1964 during a campaign when he gave absolutely the opposite impression. Nixon was again making secret threats of escalation despite the failure of bombs, 3.2 million tons of bombs by that time, to bring them to their heels. He thought that threats of even greater escalation, Hanoi, binding of Haiphong, invasions, would cause them to not surrender, not give in, but to accept what he thought of as a compromise, which they would have seen as defeat, the permanent exclusion of the leaders of the independence movement, communists, from government in Saigon, the permanent renunciation of unification of Vietnam as one. So it was certain that they would not accept those terms. I believed from my study of the Pentagon Papers and my experience that the threats would be carried out. They weren't bluffs. I believed that. I believed that they would not win the war or end the war. Again, from experience, including my experience in Vietnam, facing people that gave me a very strong impression they wouldn't quit, no matter how many of them we killed. So the war would just be longer and bigger. I saw then a prolongation under a president who'd been elected to end the war, of a pattern that had led us into endless war previously under previous presidents. This was very almost unique information. It wasn't shared by people in the anti-war movement, people who ended the war. It was just from Mort Halperin. As he said, I told everybody that who would listen. He told me, you were the one. I said, you were the one, he said, who listened and believed him. I knew his access, I knew his reliability. And where most people, as Mort said, would have found that just incredible. Nixon couldn't be doing that. And I would say, by the way, the journalist and historical community has to a large extent found my account of this incredible ever since, because I didn't have documents to prove it. Larry Berman, a very good historian of the Johnson era, and is now coming out with a book in August, I think called No Peace, No Honor, in which he's dazzled me by having found documents that I would say do demonstrate this thesis at last. I've never seen them before. He's really collected them. That's 30 years later. I was concerned that I didn't have the documents, not as concerned as I should have been. The truth is, looking back after the Pentagon Papers, I've never really been believed or convinced anybody of what I was saying about policy, most of it being unfamiliar and not something people didn't want to believe, without documents. If I'd had those documents at the time, Mort himself didn't have them. He'd been shown documents that he wasn't supposed to see as the deputy to Kissinger. Another deputy showed him documents that had been withheld from Mort himself. Threats directly delivered to the Russians through Dobrynin. He didn't have documents to give me, and he might or might not have shown them to me. If in that mood, at that time, he had shown them to me or had access to them, I certainly would have put those out rather than the Pentagon Papers. I would not have spent the time. However important the Pentagon Papers as history were, I was concerned with avoiding escalation and stopping the war. The Pentagon Papers had obvious defects, obvious to me as well as to everyone else, as an instrument for ending the war. They could illuminate the war to other people and maybe increase their disgust with it, but they didn't prove what Nixon was doing. My assertion was that Nixon was doing what essentially Truman, but in particular, and Eisenhower in the 50s, but in particular Kennedy and Johnson had done. He was still doing it. And all the Pentagon Papers could do for that message, which was my message that I put out to congressmen in person, to everybody, letters to the editor, all the Pentagon Papers could do, which was something, was to say, well, it's happened before. You may think it's hard to believe that a man would be so reckless and so mad as to expand a war, having been told what the costs would be and how hopeless it was, but 4 presidents before did it, so maybe you should entertain that possibility. You might find it hard to believe that a president who's been elected one way would simply lie. Remember that Nixon wasn't clearly lying at this time. He did expect to end the war, but he expected to do it by threats that would work, and if necessary, by escalation. I thought that his sincere belief was extremely misguided and does not do his reputation as a statesman or Henry Kissinger's, which does remain, any credit. It was foolish, reckless, uninformed. But the main thing was not to expose that about him, but to end the war. In fact, I thought that the Pentagon Papers in particular might encourage Republican Richard Nixon as a new president to uncommit himself from what Mort had said he was privately doing. He hadn't yet announced it in September. My real hope in my initial copying the Pentagon Papers, for which Tony Russo was absolutely crucial in finding a Xerox machine, helping me getting this started fast, was to release this record of Democratic recklessness and duplicity and encourage Nixon to reconsider and think, as some of his advisors like Laird and Rogers were urging him to do, his Secretary of State, his Secretary of Defense, do what they said he should do, not what he in his heart felt and Kissinger felt, and blame the war on the Democrats and say it's a lost cause, it was a noble cause, but it was a lost cause, they screwed it up, I have no choice but to cut the losses and get out. That's what I hoped it might do. I think that was a reasonable hope. I didn't have any assurance. But it was unreasonable in terms of Nixon's actual commitment. I now realize that if I'd put that out in '69, as I planned to do and tried to do through Fulbright, it would have had no effect on Nixon and the war. Even in '71, the main reaction in the White House was elation that this information was out. It made the Democrats look bad, and the tapes show that very clearly. They're all gloating how this would put the Democrats at each other's throats, and it made the Democrats, and it showed that Nixon hadn't started the war, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, it didn't prove that Nixon was continuing the policy. And that was a reaction that didn't surprise me at all. When I read the tapes, I thought, might well do that. What I didn't realize in '69 was how committed Nixon was, having been vice president during a major, crucial stage, including the Dien Bien Phu era, of our earlier involvement. He didn't think he had inherited that war. He thought it was his war and Eisenhower's war, and it was a good war and should be won, and he thought he knew a way to do it. But it was a way that the public by '69 would not endorse. He knew that. So it must be kept secret from them. Therefore, even as late as '71, the plan had not totally been carried out. A hemorrhage of secrets, even about the past, carried the possible risk that it would continue. There would be more secrets about Nixon, documents about Nixon, which unfortunately I didn't have much of. He knew I had some. National Security Study Memorandum 1. Like all government officials leaving office, I had with me the stuff I'd worked on, which is to say that I would say every, I don't know how many officials are in this audience, and to a first approximation, but let's say 90% of government officials are holding documents that are forbidden. They are forbidden to hold by the rules and the promises they've made for their memoirs, to go against Republican rivals, professional rivals, and so forth. Not all rivals are Republican, and they're not all from a different party. They are not breaking the law. We have no Official Secrets Act, unlike virtually every other country. None has ever been passed by Congress until last November, and that was vetoed. I was very struck to see the editorials that came out very properly and quickly. Seeing where I am, I'll make a different prediction now. I'm going to go 5 more minutes and take 10 minutes for questions, okay? It was actually in the course of that editorial, those editorials, most of which came out after the law had been passed, a little late, and when a veto was not expected, had excellent editorials in the Times, the Post, and elsewhere in the country, mentioning for the first time I remember seeing in print that we have no Official Secrets Act, and this would be the first, and it would be bad. I'd never seen that little point, which Tony and I were anxious to make during the trial. We didn't feel, I don't think, that it was really adequately brought out during the trial. The fact that our trial, our prosecution, for copying and possessing unauthorized copies, as I say, what every official does, actually, but never been tried before. And then there was a Boston grand jury working on the distribution, the leak part of it. That would have been the first prosecution for a revelation, the first ever. What was not appreciated was that this was as unprecedented a prosecution as the injunctions before the Supreme Court were unprecedented injunctions. The two had no precedent, and both for the same reason. The First Amendment, and which reflected the views that I've just said to you from George Madison, the author of the First Amendment, that there must not be an Official Secrets Act if, in Benjamin Franklin's words, we want to keep this a republic. That the fact is, unauthorized disclosure is ambiguous. Unauthorized disclosures occur within the system every minute of every hour, giving stuff to people that, top secrets to people that your boss has not told you to give. But in course of getting the job done, you share that information. It's against the rules. It happens constantly. It's part of the way the system works. Unauthorized disclosures to the press and Congress happen every day or every other day. They're not truly unauthorized. They're against the rules. They are not authorized by the head of an agency. They're classified information. But it reflects merely the decentralized nature of, never necessarily decentralized nature, of the secrecy process, and I should say the management of information within the government. So, in other words, public affairs officers, officials of every kind, even low-level people, are trusted in their job, will never jeopardize their job by making disclosures that in their judgment they understand their bosses will like made. In fact, that was really, I understand, why the law was vetoed. It was pointed out by Strobe Talbot to Clinton at the last minute. This would make criminals out of our public affairs officers almost every day. They are, it's not a joke, they are selectively putting out classified information. There is no leeway in that in the rules for that, but it's necessary, and of course they do it. It's necessary to fool the public, to focus their attention on this rather than that, to support this position rather than that one, to affect the budget. So we've got to revise this rule a little bit. I'm talking about disclosures that are really unauthorized, would not be approved by the president or the head of an agency if they were submitted for their permission. And those are the disclosures that most need disclosing. Remember, the reason the president doesn't want it out, I'm postulating a large class of cases, has nothing to do with keeping it from the enemy over there, the Vietnamese, the Soviets, or whoever. We may indeed be talking about things that we have directly delivered to the Soviets or the Vietnamese in the way of threats. They must not go to the public. They would not be authorized, and to think in any system of submitting them for authorization misses their very nature. To mention another founder of the Republic, Tom Paine, in his first book, Common Sense, he said, maybe a little extremely, but he said this: nations should have no secrets, for the secrets of courts are ever their defects. Now, it's defects, it's crimes, failures, errors, recklessness, breaking of treaties, defects like that, where lives are at stake, that are exactly what must be in the hands of Congress, the public, the voters, and perhaps the courts, if we are to be protected from reckless and illegal actions that the president has decided, in his opinion, are good for the national interest and his interest. Unauthorized disclosures are the heartblood of democracy and of a democratic republic. It is not the case that we need new laws criminalizing these for the first time. To have less unauthorized disclosures, I would say we need many more such unauthorized disclosures, like the Pentagon Papers, and like the documents I would have put out if I had had them. Looking back, I should have put them out, and I would have put them out, and the public needed those a lot more than the Pentagon Papers. I can look back to my own experience. When we come to the 1964-65 volumes of the Pentagon Papers, we are looking at documents, all of which were in my safe with my authorized possession in the Pentagon when I was Special Assistant to the Assistant Secretary of State of Defense in 1964-65. I knew that everything being put out about the Tonkin Gulf, every aspect that was being relayed about the Tonkin Gulf incidents was a conscious lie, partly to protect intelligence operations which were not only illegal but terribly imprudent and should never have been done, which were as foolish and provocative, let's say, and illegal as the Bay of Pigs, which should have been disclosed before it happened from every point of view. I also knew I had written drafts myself, which of course I have, being a former government official, of speeches for McNamara telling the true number of troops that were being sent to Vietnam in '65, as an addition to the 75,000 we already had, that the true number, which I had in my draft, was 100,000, and I listened to the president give, instead of that speech, the figure 50,000 the day later, directly lying to the public. I had safes full of documents of such insane, wrong, criminal, and deceptive. Deceptive is the least of it. They were deceptive because they were so foolish and would never have gotten support from an electorate that had just voted Johnson in by the largest landslide in history to avoid escalation that they feared under Goldwater. So we had a hoax of an election. The difference between the two candidates was presented as night and day, Goldwater and Johnson, in fact known to 1,000 people inside, if not more. They were very similar. And the public was about to get bombing of Vietnam, whichever one they voted for, those two. Now, I did not put any of that information out. I don't need to point fingers at McNamara or whoever else, whoever who may have thought about the policy even more wisely than I did. People like George Ball, who were more clearly against it at that point. Clark Clifford later, who was more clearly against it than I was at that point, knew more about it. I don't need to point fingers at them for not putting it out. I can say, I didn't put it out. And in my lowly form, in which my category, I was a beginner here, I was no part of a policymaker, never even became one in that year. I was like a clerk. I was like a secretary. But I knew what I was reading, and I knew where I would head. I could have given that information to Morse, as he pointed out to me, or Groening. And as Morse said, if you'd given us that information, he said to me in '71, in '64, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution would never have gotten out of committee. And if it got out, it would never have passed. But the Tonkin Gulf Resolution is just a resolution. He could have gotten it under other circumstances. He could have done without it. But later, so I didn't blame myself too much when Morse told me that. Years later, I reflected, but wait, Tonkin Gulf is August 4th. By September, I had a safe full of stuff like that about where we were going, the likelihood of bombing, the fact that not only was this a terribly reckless policy, but we had a candidate who was totally lying about it. In fact, two, because even Goldwater knew of these plans and forbore to mention them. He ran proposing a plan that he knew was in the works anyway. So, pardon me, that's how democracy was working, given our secrecy system. It worked again and again. All right, I just say, I believe, without being grandiose here about, not that I could have ended the war, I believe the documents in my possession could have averted that war, had I revealed them. That is what I should have done. It's what I wish I'd done. Of course, I didn't think of it. I don't have to tax myself with, to that degree, of moral guilt, because like all my colleagues, it just didn't occur to me to do such a thing. But I would hope it would, I know it would have occurred to me a few years later. And I would hope it would occur to other people past the, after the Pentagon Papers and Watergate and Irangate and the other examples they've had. In short, are modern Pentagon Papers, do they exist and are they needed? And should they be put out at risk? The risk is inescapable, with or without a law. I would say I have no doubt whatever that at this moment, I'll finish in 1 minute, I have no doubt whatever that there are people in this government who believe right now in the Republican administration, executive branch, that the course of this administration toward abandoning the ABM treaty is catastrophic, and that every reassurance, diplomatically, in terms of proliferation, in terms of a nuclear arms race, and that every reassurance given to us by the officials in this government is contradicted by official documents. I would put to them, they should consider sharing those documents with Congress at whatever cost to themselves, because a world is at stake. Our policy under Clinton and now pursued under Bush in Colombia is as foolish, as counterproductive, as crazy as Vietnam. I am sure there are people in the administration who know that and have documents that would support it. I call on them to do what I should have done in '64 and did not do. Go to Congress, tell the truth with documents. It can save a lot of lives. Thank you.
We have about 15 minutes for questions, and what I'd ask is that many of you in here are panelists. If you would hold back and allow the audience, and please, if you have a question, go to the mics, because this is being recorded and we'll recognize you at the microphones. So thank you.
My name is Paul Mann. I'm a reporter for Aviation Week. Is it your assumption that there was a particular point in post-World War II history at which American presidents successively concluded that it was no longer possible to trust the American people on foreign policy issues? That is, they became convinced that there either wasn't time or the public wasn't sufficiently educated that you could generate popular backing in support of a war before you actually went into it. And do you find a particular point in time at which that conclusion was reached?
That's a fascinating question, and I have never heard it posed to me or really anyone else, so I congratulate you, and I'd love to discuss it. I'd be interested to know just what led you to that question, because it's a profound question. But I do have, because I thought about the subject, I can answer it without a lot of thought. I would say it was not during the war. It was sometime prior to our entry into World War II that President Roosevelt, who I revered, my father voted for, although he was a Republican, I was brought up to revere FDR, and to a large extent I still do. But he gave us a precedent in a number of ways that other presidents have followed very consciously to very, very great cost, and it's described by the attitude you described. Obviously, President Roosevelt came to accept the views of a number of people I won't identify at this point, too long a lecture, who believed it was essential for us to be in the European war, and were aware that the American public was strongly against our active participation in the war, although not against our giving some degree of support to the English or Allies. As I understand the isolationist position in Congress, from Bruce Russett's very interesting book on that, the congressional opposition was not to giving financial aid to the British, for example, but to direct combat participation in the war. And it almost won. So Roosevelt was facing a situation where he felt strongly in his own mind that the country was wrong on this. And he somehow had to lead them on. I remember once Bill Buckley on his program, the one time I was on his program, thinking to confound me. I was on trial. I'd just come from the courtroom. He says, you talk a lot about lying, presidential lying, if there's such a thing. He says, what about FDR's saying that we had peaceful missions in the Atlantic, with destroyers who in fact were carrying on anti-submarine operations against the Germans? What would you call that? I said, well, I'd call it a lie. What would you call it? He was very taken aback. He wasn't prepared for that answer. He said, well, he says, I don't know that I would call it a lie. I was very young at the time. That's what he said. So I said to him, well, sometimes when we're young, we know more than we know later about the difference between lying and truth. We get out of it. But anyway, what I'm saying to you is I think that I know that example is consciously in the minds and often explicitly referred to by Assistant Secretaries of State and Defense and higher when they are justifying in their own minds the necessity to lie to the public. They say, after all, we wouldn't have defeated Hitler, we wouldn't have gotten into the war without a lot of deception.
But behind that assumption is the assumption, effectively, that democracy doesn't work.
Well, it's not necessarily a generalization. Remember that because it's a specific situation. See, the public is wrong here, in this case, so I have to go around them. Certainly that's what each of these presidents thought about Vietnam. They couldn't handle the truth. I'm doing what is necessary, but they wouldn't support that. It's a specific case. But of course you're right, and again, it shows the wisdom behind your question. I would say, of course, there's a bureaucratic mentality and an elitist mentality, but it's not just parties. It doesn't seem to be limited to the Eastern establishment or the Western establishment. It's very much a bureaucratic party, which is very anti-democratic. The Congress, to start with, is parochial, self-interested, politically minded, unlike us who think of the national interest. They think of their little constituency. Drunk, as Ehrlichman used to say all the time, total contempt for Congress. They drink all the time. Now, he had a boss who had a little problem. But in fact, the congressmen were drunk. Congressmen can't be trusted, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to protect the country from Congress and ultimately from the public, from the right wing, from the left wing. They don't worry about the left wing very much. They think, it's ineffective and not very large. But the right wing will make us do things here's, by the way, I'll give you a rationale that I think is very important, that has never been, where Johnson in effect has never been given enough credit. It does not justify what he did. But in his mind, I'm sure that he and McNamara, in what they were doing in the way of bombing, felt that they were on a course that was protecting the country from the proposals of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who would, if they exposed their own views by resigning and speaking out, as one might well say they should have done given their convictions, except that they were military men under the UCMJ. If they did that, if they exposed themselves to democracy, they had reason to fear the public will back those catastrophic proposals, those crazy proposals. And let me tell you, I agree with Johnson and McNamara on those. The proposals of the Joint Chiefs were crazy. They would not have won. They would have risked war with China, which may be what some of them wanted, and that would have been nuclear war. So Johnson and the others said, we have to deceive, but we have to follow a course which will give the Joint Chiefs enough of what they want so they won't resign and press for their proposal. And because it might be supported by the public, who'll say, well, we don't know whether it'll work or not. Let's do it. Let's win. Let's get this over. The public, as has been pointed out, thought till very late in the game, win or get out. Even after Tet, the mood was not get out. It was win or get out. And a Joint Chiefs, some of the people who believed that it would have won, taxed the Joint Chiefs for not exposing their views, frankly, and following that. And that has some merit, although I must say I'm happy to see that civilian control was observed constitutionally here. I'm glad they didn't do that on constitutional grounds and policy grounds, because I thought their policy was terrible. But Johnson then thought, and to some degree Nixon perhaps, but Johnson and Kennedy thought, I have to lie. I need to lie, partly because the public is so uninformed and might back policies that were terrible if they heard about them. If they knew they had Joint Chiefs backing, if they knew that, they might back them. So I have to conceal that. But they were not, so they followed a middle course of an endless escalating war that wasn't as bad as the Joint Chiefs proposed. They did not consider getting out instead. They just did not consider, not because the proposal was not made. The proposal was made, and not only by George Ball, but by William Bundy, Assistant Secretary of Defense, Clark Clifford, Hubert Humphrey, the Vice President, gave that advice to the President in 64, 65. I knew none of that in the Pentagon or when I read the Pentagon papers, because their dovish views were so secret that I never saw them as Special Assistant to the Assistant Secretary of Defense. So, and if it was important not to keep me from seeing it, it was doubly important not to keep, not to allow the Congress to see it, or the President, and so forth. And of course, it's conceivable that I would have leaked them, reliable as I was. That might have done it then, and that would have been to the good. I wish that had happened. Or I might not, in which case I'd still be feeling guilty.